Okay, welcome to this Buddhism Anthology A-level video on Karen Armstrong's book on the Buddha's Enlightenment, chapter 3 of her book, The Buddha. And this is section 5 that we're looking at here. So let's read it and then we'll go through it and see what it says. So, an essential element had been what Gautama called seclusion. He had been left alone. He could never have entered the ecstatic state if his nurses had distracted him with their chatter. Meditation required privacy and silence, but this seclusion went beyond physical solitude. Sitting under the rose apple tree, his mind had been separated from desire for material things and from anything unwholesome and unprofitable. Since he left home 6 years before, Gautama had been fighting his human nature, crushing its every impulse. He had come to distrust any kind of pleasure. But now he asked himself, why should he be afraid of the type of joy he had experienced on that long ago afternoon? The pure delight had had nothing to do with the greedy craving or sensual desire. Some joyful experiences could actually lead to an abandonment of egoism and to the achievement of an exaltic yogic state. Again, as soon as he had posed the question himself, Gautama responded with his usual confidence and decisiveness. "I am not afraid of such pleasures," he said. The secret was to reproduce the seclusion that had led to his trance and foster such wholesome kusala states of mind as the disinterested compassion that had made him grieve for the insects and shoots of the young grass at the same time. He would carefully avoid any state of mind that would not be helpful or would impede his enlightenment. So let's think about this text here. Let's start with this word seclusion. Seclusion here in yellow, and again he talks about seclusion and again we find it here. This seclusion went beyond physical solitude. So what's going on here with this term seclusion? Solitude, withdrawal. Look at these terms. Solitude. The seclusion went beyond physical solitude. The state of being separate from other people. COVID-19, if you remember, whenever you're watching this video, introduced an element of this physical seclusion, separation from others. The Buddha had spent time with those who had done this, the ascetics, the 5 ascetics. And this is, you find this when you read the Pali Canon, the Sutta Pitaka discourses. He says in one, "Such was my seclusion that I would plunge into some forest and live there. If I saw a cowherd or a shepherd or a grass cutter, a wood gatherer or a forester, I would flee so they would not see me or them." Or again, he says in another extract, "I wish to go into solitude for half a month. No one is to come and see me except the one who brings my food." So he's making here a distinction between two things. Physical solitude and the kind of psychological solitude. And he considered physical solitude actually to be more important than the two, if you read some of the Pali Canon. And Armstrong's right to identify this as an important aspect of the Buddha. It's there in the Pali Canon, and so it's an important aspect of his life, given the ascetic background and so on, to consider. So we move on. he had been left alone. Remember, this is the story of the rose apple tree. When had he been left alone? At some point during his childhood, but it could have been as late as his early 20s, but we just don't know. He'd been left alone. He would never have entered an ecstatic state if his nurses had distracted him with their chatter. Isn't that interesting, that phrase, distracted him with their chatter? This is getting back to this idea of psychological separation, solitude, and the difference between that and physical separation. But the seclusion went beyond physical solitude. Sitting under the rose apple tree, his mind had been separated from desire for material things.
I need to come in.
So let's just pick up this word, ecstatic state. Ecstatic state. We've looked at the four jhanas when we've looked at Theravada Buddhism. Look back at that. And we've looked in the previous section at the first jhana. And now we're thinking about the first and the second jhana. The second jhana is described as an ecstatic state that you're in. So we read on. Sitting under the rose apple tree, his mind had been separated from desire for material things and from anything unwholesome and unprofitable. So that's the first of the jhanas, for the mind to be separated from desire for material things, from anything unwholesome and unprofitable. To develop this state of mind, this is the first and to an extent the second jhana, what happens. So we're not only recounting the life of the Buddha, we are giving Buddhist teaching, and this is a reconstruction of Buddhist teaching by Karen Armstrong. And it's not all bad, it's not all good, but it's a reconstruction, you have to realize. And it's a reconstruction along, it seems, quite Theravada lines. And you need to realize the way this is being said is not without import. It's not for one of the traditions or the other. And we want to just think about this phrase, sitting under the rose apple tree. Sitting under the rose apple tree, and as he goes on, his mind is separated from material things. One question we'd like to ask is Armstrong just quoting very late dramatized accounts of the Buddha? Up to 700 years after his life, the 2nd century CE, we have a collection, a text called the 10 Acts of the Buddha. And in some Buddhist A-level texts, like Dominique Side, she also reconstructs the life of the Buddha in 10 acts, following this classical method of reconstructing a life of the Buddha. But is it the historical Buddha? This is an important historical critical question. And to what extent is this account of the Buddha's life an academic one, or an accurate one, a critical one? And Armstrong leaves you, is claiming authority, he's claiming that this is the way it is, but we just don't know that. She's not acknowledging that perhaps hers is an over-dramatized account of the life of the Buddha that may or may not in fact be true. So we come to read on. Since he had left his home 6 years before, Gautama had been fighting his human nature and crushing its every impulse. Let's just focus on this little word, impulse. This whole sentence is all about the ascetic practices. His time fasting. Remember some of the images of the Buddha, who is emaciated, absolutely emaciated, thin, and you can see his bones, you can see his rib cage. This is the time that he was a ascetic. That's what this passage is referring to, and it culminated in his act of fasting. It wasn't the first thing he did, but it culminated in this act of fasting. And we read on. He had come to distrust any kind of pleasure, but he now asked himself, why should he be afraid of the type of joy he had experienced not long ago afternoon? Let's pause there. Let's just highlight that and look at it. Why should he be afraid of the kind of joy he had experienced not long ago afternoon? Armstrong is doing more than just describing the jhanas here, the experiences of pleasure and beyond that. The first and the second jhanas. This is now the second jhana. The second jhana. And the key element of the second jhana is this idea of joy. Joy or pati is the idea of the second jhana. Is a feeling, a subtle, refined sort of happiness. It's not the sort of gregarious party happiness, but it's a kind of deep happiness, that Buddhist sort of transcendent happiness, and not an imminent happiness. And this is important because Buddhists have been accused of having a pessimistic or depressing faith. And they claim the opposite. The Dalai Lama, think about the Dalai Lama often, and he writes a little book about joy with Desmond Tutu. Because they see their faith is about finding true happiness, not temporary happiness, but true happiness. And true happiness is being unattached to worldly possessions. In Buddhist psychology, joy is seen as the result of living a virtuous living, a sign of successful meditation, as an indication of growing spirituality and maturity, spiritual maturity. And in fact, there are many kinds of joy identified in Buddhism. Perhaps one of the important ones is sympathetic joy. And this is the ability to rejoice in the success of other people, the happiness of others. In one story, a certain sage called Bavari heard the Buddha experienced exaltation and jubilation and elation, the calm joy you can feel contemplating a statue of the Buddha. Now, this is very much Theravada territory, but not solely. But in particular, the great Theravadan scholar, Buddha Aghosha, in his Visuddhimagga, the clarification of the way, says joy is categorized according to its intensity and the effect it can have on the body. There is also minor joy, momentary joy, showering joy, uplifting joy, pervading joy. Now, some people are cautious about joy, thinking it might lead to attachment. But Buddha Aghosha, the Theravadan scholar of the 5th century, says, in terms of joy, it is called joy because it is to be enjoyed. Joy is an important part of the jhanas. It's one of the 7 limbs that lead to enlightenment, he says. So let's crack on then. That pure that pure delight has nothing to do with greedy craving or sensual desire. Some joyful, there's that word again, joyful experiences. But let's pause and just pick up that one little phrase. Let's do it in light green. Greedy craving or sensual, nothing to do with greedy craving or sensual desires. And Armstrong's exploring further this, not only the second jhana, he's describing, or she's describing, the second noble truth. The problem of suffering is that it's caused by ignorance. Think about the Tibetan wheel of life, and it is ignorance that is the first link in the 12 links of dependent origination. The 3 poisons, it is ignorance is the first. Ignorance, greed, and hatred. And craving or tana is what is driven by these 3 poisons. The tana can be broken down into 3 types. The first being kama tana, general physical rupa body desire. And then there's desire of the mind, vibhanatana, to be the greatest, and bhavanatana, to be left alone and quiet, sort of introverts desire. So craving or sensual desire, Armstrong's construction of the Buddha and his teaching is probably correct to highlight this, but it is again a certain construction, perhaps a Theravada construction. So we read on. Some joyful experiences could actually lead to the abandonment of egoism and the achievement of an exalted yogic state. This sounds like a very Western construction of Buddhist thinking, an exalted yogic state. It's a sort of Westernization of Buddhism. Egoism is a sort of Freudian term. The ego, I mean, it's an English term, isn't it? It's not even like Buddhist. The mind is the Buddhist term. You know, even there's the rejection of the ego of the mind in Buddhism. Okay, let's keep going. Again, as soon as he had posed the question to himself, Gautama responded with his usual confident decisiveness. I am not afraid of such pleasures, he said. Well, I'd like to know what she's quoting here. I am not afraid of such pleasures, he said. Where did he say it? What's she quoting here? I'm not entirely sure. I think she's quoting the 10 acts of the Buddha. Is she quoting somewhere in the Pali Canon? I'm not sure. It is. It sounds like the 10 acts of the Buddha. She's not referencing her sources very well here. The secret was to reproduce the seclusion. There's that word, seclusion again, that we talked about earlier, and that this had led to his trance and foster such wholesome, and here's a key word, kusala. Kusala. Let's pause for this word. Kusala, states of mind. Kusala states of mind. What are kusala states of mind? Well, the word kusala can be explained as karmically wholesome, profitable, salutary, morally good, skillful, blameless. And if you put the word a in front of it, akusala is the opposite. So in Buddhism, the mind is more important than the physical body and the state of the mind. And if the mind is pure, if it's kusala, as opposed to akusala, then that's good. So we read on. As the disinterested compassion that had made him grieve for the insects and shoots and young grass. Let's pause. This is a very interesting little passage here, and I think, apart from this phrase, the disinterested compassion that gave him grief for the insects, the shoots, and the young grass, is this Jainism. Let me see if I can. Here's some Jainism. Look at these Jains. This is long before COVID-19. Yes, they've got their face masks. And notice the little sticks they're carrying. Actually, it could be a brush. These guys sort of predate Buddhists and Buddhism. The Jains were an alternative religion, one of 3 or 4 groups outside of Hinduism. And the Buddhists probably met these guys during his, after age 29, apparent and classical dating through to age 36. He would have come across these guys as one group of other groups in the Shramana movement. The Shramana movement, including others like the materialists and so on. And the Jains are absolutely committed to pacifism, that individuals should be very careful about even insects and the shoots of young grass. They would, the Jains will brush their feet brush the ground in front of their feet so they don't tread and kill something. So at that time, we finish off, he would carefully avoid any state of mind that would not be helpful or impede his enlightenment. And this is just, this bit here is just Armstrong commenting on the Buddha. How does she know? That's her, again, we have to bear in mind, this is her Western construction as a sort of liberal ex-Christian, well, liberal nun, Christian nun, with a very pluralist perspective, a state of mind that would not be helpful or would impede his enlightenment. Again, and what she's doing, it's constructing quite a Theravada way of thinking, and we need to kind of be critical of that. So we end there and move on to the